So I was just hanging out in the park with Sonda this morning, and I was thinking about what today's vlog would be about. I was listening to a podcast like I always do, and that's when it hit me. Why don't I do an episode about my favorite podcasts? We'll go home for a treat soon, bubs. I just have to finish my coffee. All right, I got quite a lot of video editing done. I definitely need to eat something, and then I think that I'm gonna go skating. I haven't done that in a while.
See you in a bit, Sonia.
Okay, first I want to talk about a podcast that I discovered pretty recently, but I've really been enjoying. It's called the Mad Scientist Podcast, and it's hosted by Chris Cogswell and Marie Mayhew. Now, this is a science podcast, but with a bit of a twist. They do cover some incredibly sciencey topics like climate change and archaeology, but they also take a scientific approach to some topics that people tend to be a little bit more skeptical of, like, UFOs, ghosts, and all sorts of paranormal stuff like that. They actually had a podcast recently that was really intriguing on the Jinn of Arabic folklore. I definitely recommend that you guys check that one out. Next, we're gonna cover a podcast that I don't listen to as often as I used to, but it's definitely the podcast that I've listened to the longest, and that is Stuff You Should Know, hosted by Josh Clark and Chuck Bryant. Now, these guys have been at it for a while. I think they've been podcasting since 2008. So if there's a podcast topic, they've probably done it by now. Check out this podcast to learn about Rosa Parks, presidential pardons, lawns, pretty much anything. They had a recent episode on peanut butter that I thought was really fascinating. So go check out Stuff You Should Know. Next up, I want to talk about my favorite music podcast, which is No Dogs in Space, hosted by Marcus Parks and Carolina Hidalgo. On this podcast, they mostly cover punk rock. They have a really great series on the Misfits, on the Ramones. They had an awesome one recently on Joy Division. Now I actually understand why people are obsessed with that band. It's just a really well-produced podcast, really well-researched, lots of great stories, and I really recommend that you check out No Dogs in Space. Next up, I want to talk about another great show called The Last Podcast on the Left. This one's hosted by Marcus Parks, Henry Zabrowski, and Ben Kissel. This is like a horror comedy podcast, I guess. They do cover serial killers, but they also talk about lots of other spooky topics like ghosts and aliens and stuff like that. But it's actually their episodes on cults that I find the most fascinating, just from a psychological perspective. So if you like scary stuff and you like funny stuff, check out The Last Podcast on the Left. One of my favorite series that they've done is on the Heaven's Gate cult. They've got a really good one about Charles Manson as well. Okay, so now we get to talk about my favorite podcast, and that is definitely Wizard and the Bruiser, hosted by Holden McNeely and Jake Young. Now, this is a nerdy podcast, and I started listening to it because I wanted to learn more about nerdy stuff like Dragon Ball Z and Spider-Man and whatnot. But I actually get a lot out of this podcast from a business perspective as well, because you get to learn about the habits and tactics of incredibly successful people who created fundamental pop culture icons. Some of their best episodes, in my opinion, are their episode on Final Fantasy VII and their episode on Zelda. So give a listen to one of those episodes, and if you don't like it, well, I don't know, there's no help for you. All right, that's today's vlog. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I hope that you check out some of these shows. Let me know down in the comments what are some of your favorite podcasts. If you're loving this content, make sure that you subscribe to the channel. I'm doing daily vlogs now, so I'll see you guys tomorrow.